The second mental state I want to explore is criminal negligence. That's where our actor knew or should have known of a substantial and unjustifiable risk that the resulting harm could have happened. This mens rea is an absence of intent to cause the resulting harm. But still, it's a blameworthy mens rea. Still, we say, even though you didn't intend the result, we think you should be punished because you engaged in this kind of high risk-taking behavior. Much of what we do every day involves taking risks. Every time we drive our car, every time we fly in an airplane, for some people they bungee jump or they skydive. Not me, but for others. That's risk-taking behavior. And we say that's okay because we're driving properly. The risk is justified that we're undertaking. It's quite low that a harm will happen. But what we're going to examine here is when defendants engaging in risk-taking behavior that we don't want to support, that it's creating a substantial and unjustifiable risk of a harm. So let's take the act of shooting a gun. In the previous example, our defendant put that gun to the victim's head and said, "I'm going to kill you." Imagine now that instead of pointing the gun at someone's head and pulling the trigger, we have an actor who's shooting at light poles or shooting at trees, where there is a great chance that a bullet will ricochet and hit a pedestrian or hit somebody in the street. That actor is engaging in risk-taking behavior that we can't condone. And if someone should die from the bullet ricocheting from the light pole, we want to say the defendant has acted with a level of criminal negligence because the risk was substantial that someone could get hit with a falling bullet. And if a person were to get hit, the consequences are extremely grave. Further, unless we hear otherwise, it didn't seem like there's any justifiable reason for taking pot shots at the light standards. This mens rea also fits DeSena's mental state. You'll recall the case that we read where Mr. DeSena got into a car knowing he was subject to seizures. He was charged with the crime of criminal negligence in the operation of a vehicle resulting in death. When we discussed DeSena, we only looked at whether he did the actus reus of the crime. That is, whether he was operating a vehicle. Now let's turn to the mens rea of the crime. The mens rea is criminal negligence. If we were going to look at DeSena's mental state, it could be argued that he behaved with criminal negligence. Why am I saying that? Because when he got in that car, he knew, or he should have known, that he ran a substantial and unjustifiable risk that he could have a seizure while driving. And if he could have a seizure while driving, it could result in great harm. That's what criminal negligence looks like. Later in the course, we're going to examine more deeply what the terms built into criminal negligence means, what substantial and unjustifiable mean. But for our purposes today, it's enough to start to recognize the distinction between a mens rea that requires defendant intend the result and a mens rea of criminal negligence that doesn't require intent but is still blameworthy. Finally, we will explore the concept of strict liability, which is actually the lack of a mens rea. In very limited situations, our defendant may be convicted of only having committed an actus reus without any mental state. In a strict liability crime, that means prosecution only needs to prove the actus reus beyond a reasonable doubt. Doesn't have to prove that defendant entertained any particular criminal mens rea. If we have a crime that has no mens rea, that also means the defendant can't present any defense that counters the existence of a mens rea. Now, strict liability crimes fly in the face of general principles that say convictions require a criminal mens rea. That's why very few crimes fall into this category. Generally, they're about traffic violations or selling bad meat. In this lecture, we're going to discuss statutory rape, a crime that is strict liability in the majority of states in the country.